Welcome to White Shadows. Today we're going to briefly discuss about vampires. Hope you are ready for this one. So turn on the lights and hide your juicy blood-filled vessels going all over your body. First we're going to discuss, what is a vampire? Vampires are defined by a variety of traits, with the most consistent being their need to drink human blood. Typically, they use their sharp fangs to drain the blood from their victims, often killing them in the process and transforming them into vampires as well. Generally, vampires are nocturnal creatures, as sunlight weakens their powers. Many are said to possess the ability to transform into a bat or a wolf. With superhuman strength and a hypnotic, seductive influence over their prey, vampires are both formidable and alluring. They are also famously unable to reflect in mirrors or cast shadows. Vlad the Impaler. It is commonly believed that Bram Stoker named Count Dracula after Vlad Dracula, also known as Vlad the Impaler. Born in Transylvania, Romania, Vlad ruled over Wallachia at various points between 1448 and 1477. Historians often describe him as a ruler who, while just, employed brutal methods, particularly in his fight against the Ottoman Empire. His infamous nickname came from his preferred method of execution, impaling his enemies on sharp wooden stakes. Legend has it that Vlad Dracula would dine among his dying victims, dipping his bread in their blood. While the truth of these chilling stories remains uncertain, they are thought to have inspired Stoker's creation of Count Dracula, who also hails from Transylvania, drinks blood, and can be killed by a stake through the heart. However, according to Dracula expert Elizabeth Miller, Stoker did not directly model Count Dracula after Vlad Dracula. Still, the similarities between the two figures are undeniably compelling. Mercy Brown Vampire Incident. Mercy Brown is considered one of the most infamous figures in vampire lore, rivaling Count Dracula in notoriety. Unlike Dracula, however, Mercy was a real person. She lived in Exeter, Rhode Island, and was the daughter of a local farmer, George Brown. In the late 1800s, after George lost several family members, including Mercy, to tuberculosis, the community began to blame Mercy for their deaths. During this time, it was common for people to attribute multiple deaths in a single family to the actions of the undead. As a result, the bodies of deceased family members were often exhumed in search of signs of vampirism. When Mercy's body was exhumed and showed little decay, which was not unusual, as she had been placed in an above-ground vault during the harsh New England winter, the townspeople accused her of being a vampire responsible for spreading illness to her family. They removed her heart, burned it, and then fed the ashes to her sick brother. Not surprisingly, he died shortly after. Are vampires real? During the Middle Ages, vampire superstitions were widespread, especially as the plague ravaged entire towns. The disease often left its victims with bleeding mouth lesions, which to the uneducated appeared to be a clear sign of vampirism. Anyone showing unusual physical or emotional symptoms was sometimes accused of being a vampire. Some researchers suggest that porphyria, a blood disorder causing severe blisters on skin exposed to sunlight, may have contributed to the vampire legend. Certain symptoms of this disorder could be temporarily alleviated by drinking blood, further linking it to vampire myths. Other illnesses, such as rabies or goiter, were also thought to be connected to vampirism. When a person was suspected of being a vampire, their body was often exhumed and examined for signs of the undead. In some cases, a stake was driven through the heart to ensure they remained dead. Suspected vampires were also decapitated and burned, a practice that continued into the 19th century. People who call themselves a real vampire. While modern science has dispelled many of the vampire fears of the past, individuals who identify as vampires still exist. These are ordinary people who drink small amounts of blood, often in an effort to maintain their health, though this practice is widely seen as misguided. Self-identified vampire communities can be found online and in cities around the world. To avoid reviving old superstitions, most modern vampires prefer to keep their practices private, conducting their feeding rituals, which may involve drinking blood from willing donors, away from the public eye. Some vampires don't consume human blood, but instead claim to feed on the energy of others. Many of them say they become agitated or depressed if they don't feed regularly. Vampires gained mainstream popularity after the publication of Dracula, and since then, the iconic figure has been featured in numerous films, books, and television shows. With society's ongoing fascination with horror, both real and fictional vampires are likely to remain a part of our cultural landscape for years to come. Now I'm going to tell you a story coming from a Reddit user named lexsang. The title I have given to this story is Eyes of the Unknown, so here it goes. I was preparing to go to bed, still in my clothes and waiting for my partner to finish getting ready. I decided to lie down for a moment, closing my eyes to relax. I was still fully aware and conscious, but as I lay there, I felt my sense of awareness shift. While I could still feel my body, it felt distant like a thin veil, and I was suddenly somewhere else entirely on a spiritual level. It's difficult to describe to someone who hasn't experienced an out-of-body sensation, but although I knew I was lying in my bed, that reality seemed almost like an illusion compared to the overwhelming intensity of the other world I found myself in. I stood on an endless, shifting plane, surrounded by strange creatures with deer skulls for heads, sharp teeth, and jagged bone antlers. Their bodies seemed to be made of flesh-like robes. Among them, a tall, humanoid figure appeared, with a sharp jawline and cold, emotionless features. It stared at me with glowing blue eyes, and I felt a chilling sense that it was the force behind these unsettling visions. Time seemed to stretch on as it silently observed me, pushing horrific images into my mind. The deer-headed beings around me twisted in ways that defied logic, their movements bending in impossible, non-Euclidean shapes, all set in an infinite, blood-soaked landscape. I call it infinite because there was no clear boundary to the realm, no edges, no limits. As strange and horrifying as it was, I felt no fear during the experience, not because I was brave, but because there was simply no fear within me. I can't explain why I felt that way. It was just an absence of fear. The next morning, while walking my partner to work, they mentioned having a disturbing spiritual experience of their own the previous night. They described feeling violent, intrusive thoughts being forced into their mind, only to dissipate when they told whatever it was to leave. The most unsettling part was when they described the entity's eyes, bright blue, just like the ones I had seen. I'd never had a shared experience with a spiritual entity before, and hearing them recount the same details made it all the more real for me. My partner believed it was some kind of entity feeding off fear, floating around and feeding on our emotions. Neither of us can fully comprehend what we encountered or what it wanted, but it hasn't returned. From what I can gather, vampiric spirits come in many forms. The key takeaway is that many of them were never human, and they don't follow any human code of morality. If they have any morals at all, they exist outside of our world, unconstrained by its rules. They're not something anyone should seek out, expecting them to behave like the supernatural creatures of fiction.